Greetings, friends. This is Ian MacKenzie here, and I am delighted to be joined by my good friend, Eamon Armstrong. Welcome, Eamon.
Pleasure to be here.
This is a special interview, because I'm interviewing you about interviewing, the art of interviewing for podcasts in particular. And I'm excited by this because, one, I consider you my podcast mentor, of which, you sort of modeled a way into this crazy game, and through your own podcast called Life is a Festival. And it's one of my inspirations, certainly, in feeling like I could wade into this territory as well. And one of the things I've been delighted by in listening to your episodes is how great an interviewer you are. And myself, I spent a decade or so mostly in the realm of documentary, where, of course, I have a lot of skills then interviewing folks for on camera, but typically I'm not heard, right, as an interviewer for at least my style of documentary. It's not like a Werner Herzog kind of thing. And so it's very different, I realized, when I stepped into podcasting, where I was like, oh, people are going to hear me interviewing the person. And so I realized, I was like, oh, I have to really develop a different kind of awareness and a different way of engaging with the guest. And hearing you interview your folks was certainly a model that I appreciated. And so delighted to be here to talk about how to be a great podcast interviewer.
Well, thanks, Ian. And not only are people going to hear you on a podcast, but you are actually the person that they come for. They come for the guest, but they stay for you. And so you have to walk this line where you're focused on the guest. It's about the guest. It's interesting for the audience because the guest is an expert. But at the same time, you want them to like you, so that they want to come back and hear you talk. They want you to say the questions they might say. They want to identify with you. They want to be connected with you. And so you're talking about being a documentary filmmaker, where the goal is to get the best response. And the goal is still to get the best response, but also you're in real time showing yourself and showing who you are and showing your personality while doing that. So you got to do both at once.
So tell me a little too about your Life is a Festival podcast, or your Life is a Festival persona. Like, how much is it just you, Eamon, and how much is it evolved as your own way of interviewing your guests and your own, like you said, like your own character, your own persona that people seem to connect with? And maybe as well, what are the types of things that people reflect to you of like, oh, I love how you're so this way, when you're interviewing your guests?
Yeah, funny you should use the term persona, because I think what people love about my show is that there's no persona. It's me. It's me. The only way in which I am different on my show is that I'm less self-absorbed. In real life, I got stories. I talk about myself. I can't stop. My podcast is basically like the best of me, but as me. There's no persona. There's no intention to create a certain way of being, because the whole point of my podcast is my authentic inquiry. And I'll often offer my own vulnerable storytelling. I try to keep it limited because it can be self-indulgent and boring, but I offer my vulnerability to invite my guests to be more vulnerable. And you're saying, what do people reflect to you? I think what I'm proudest of is what my guests actually reflect to me, which is that I have guests who show up on my show and they are often willing to share more personal details, take bigger risks, share things that they haven't shared before, because I create a safe space. And so maybe, one of the first places to start with this is, how do you make your guest feel safe to give you their best material? Researching the guest and then making the guest feel safe are probably the first kind of like two parts for me of my interview process. So I don't know if you want to start with that, but in terms of advice for burgeoning podcast hosts, making a guest feel safe so that they're inspired to give you their best, to me, is absolutely key to the game.
Thanks for that. Just spending a bit of time too on that preparation, as we maybe walk through sort of the linear approach to a podcast. Absolutely. I think the main initial advice, tip, plea is to properly prepare for a guest, because I think there's nothing worse, of course, than, showing up to an interview. And I mean, you as the host may have sort of too blank a slate, right, to even understand where to go or how to step into a conversation with someone. but also I find it's a way of showing respect to your guest by actually doing a proper amount of research. And, I love, for example, going as deep as I can through the internet or looking at old, archival interviews from a decade ago, depending on the guest, and, pulling out some choice things that I found really interesting. And then when I begin to ask those kinds of questions or dig deep like that, by and large, the guests are like, wow, like they get impressed pretty quick. They're like, oh, wow, you really did your research. And it shows, at least in their willingness to lean in more, I think, to the interview, right? Because I think a lot of interview guests often are kind of like, they're there to see what you've brought, but typically they're not willing to just suddenly spill it all, right? Like they, even unconsciously, I think, are kind of like, okay, let's see where this person's at. And by showing that you've done the work, I think that builds trust, right? For you to be able to with that person.
Well, yeah, and especially people who are interviewed a lot, you'll get sound bites if they don't feel like you're making them someone special. Why would they make you someone special? And I have a great example of this. I interviewed Michael Murphy, who's one of the founders of Esalen. He was in his 90s at that time. I think he's still in his 90s now. I showed up. We started talking. He jumped right into like a typical kind of spiel, and he went on for about 20 minutes. And then I had a moment where like I could kind of like demonstrate like what I was there to do, and I was like, so you wrote this essay on evolutionary panentheism, and I was wondering if I could share what I believe that is in my own words, and you can tell me if I'm right. And so I was signaling to him, I've done the research, I've taken the time to study your work, and here's my attempt to like show you that I've learned it. And I gave him my explanation of it, and his tone completely shifted. And all of a sudden, the show just turned into this fun conversation where I think what he was expecting was some kind of dry interview where someone would be like, so what is Esalen? What is the human potential movement? Versus like, oh, you get me, so let's go deeper. And then he was telling stories about Esalen back in the day and Hunter S. Thompson and all these things that ended up being really like juicy sound bites and fun radio, because I'd showed him not just that I'd done the research, but that I had come prepared enough that he could go deeper with me, and it would be a much more interesting conversation for him. So the research is so important. And I would say, like, signal to your guests that you did the research, like show them, let them know that you came to play and that you brought a lot to the party. At the very end of the show, he's like, thanks for bringing so much to the party. It's just more fun. And in terms of doing the research, we're all pretty busy. A lot of times you're like, oh, I got to squeeze this in. For me, if I can listen to a podcast that they've been on, preferably their favorite podcast they've ever been on, it's a great way of building my own roadmap for the conversation, because I get to hear how they answer things. I get to hear what questions light them up, what questions they don't really respond to. And something that'll come up a lot in this conversation is that podcasting is iterative. And that's part of why it's so fucking great. Can I say fucking great? Can I say fucking on this? Okay, great. Fucking great. It's iterative. So every time you do it, you learn. Every time you research, you get better at researching. Every time you do a podcast, you must always listen to the whole podcast. I know some people hate hearing their own voice, but you just iterate and iterate. And so for me, the process of preparing for the podcast means that when I now listen to podcasts, I listen to how people are interviewed. And so when it's time to interview them, I know the kinds of questions that are going to be boring. I know the kinds of stories that they like telling. And I'm not going to try to mirror some other podcast and like grab that person's questions. But I get a sense of tone. I get a sense of kind of like, ooh, that's interesting. That podcast host didn't go deeper on this subject, but I would. This podcast was about psychedelics, but my podcast is more about festivals. How can I kind of like bring that vibe into like my topic? And so listening to someone on a podcast is great. Reading their new material, anything new that they've done is great, because if they can speak about something that's really alive for them and that's new, they're going to be more likely to want to share it because they're working with ideas that are fresh. And you want to give them the opportunity to do something that isn't just a good interview, but is actually a deeper excavation of their own ideas and thinking in real time with you. And if you get them to do that, they're going to tell everybody, and that's going to help you build your podcast.
Nice. Let's talk about roadmap, which you also mentioned too. Which
I want to do the make the guest feel safe thing before the roadmap. Is that cool?
Well, we're gonna get there. Yeah, I
Okay.
think that'll be
Okay.
third.
Well,
yeah.
okay. All right. Sorry to
Because
rush
the
you.
way, the way I'm
I
approaching
don't think
this,
you're editing this. So yeah. Okay.
no, this is all
You
raw,
interview
baby.
me. How about you interview me and I don't
All right.
take the reins. Guests will do that though. Guests will do that. Got to be
They
prepared.
can do that. So here's so the way I'm approaching it, right, is so you're doing the research. This is pre-interview, right? You're doing the research, you're listening to other podcasts from that person, you're getting a sense of their flavor, things that are interesting to them. So now you begin to build your roadmap. This is how I would suggest, and this is what I do, right? I'll have my roadmap of, okay, here's how I would structure the conversation. Here's where it would go, maybe, right? But enough of a maybe that it's there, almost like a backbone or a thread or a sense of like, why am I interviewing this person, right? Like, what would hitting the mark be for me? As an interviewer, I like having a bit of that built out beforehand. And it may look a bit different for different podcast guests, but I would say that's really vital to have a sense of the flow of possible conversation, where it could go, as you prepare and step forward into that interview. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. So you never want to be in a place where you don't know where to go next. You always want to have something at your fingertips. And that's part of why the research is so important. Roadmap is how I describe it too, because I don't have a list of interview questions because I want to have a conversational experience. So the roadmap is basically what I do is it's spaghetti on the wall as I'm getting to know them. So I'm just throwing things on a notes document. And then I start to see the architecture of a conversation take shape. And I create a roadmap of what might be almost like an essay about this person, where it follows a linear arc that I would really enjoy. Are you there? Did you go away?
I'm still there. I'm just highlighting you because the stuff is so good. We got to spotlight you.
See, like you can't let your guests take the wheel. So, well, they will, but you just got to bring it back. And also authentic moments where things are a little silly or things are a little weird. They actually work for podcasts, so don't be afraid of them. But yeah, the roadmap for me is that I create this architecture and it has certain core themes. I've like bucketed certain themes. And I know that when I interview them, it's not going to follow that path. But it's almost like a constellation. I know where things could go. And I know certain key ideas that will get me into buckets that I care about. And so what that means is that when I'm interviewing them, it's not, well, thank you for that answer. Very interesting. Now I will ask you this next question, because I always want it to flow as if it's a conversation, which is what it is, and say, okay, a minute ago, you mentioned a certain experience of vulnerability. And this reminds me of an interview you gave in 2010 where you talked about vulnerability versus openness. I'd like to talk about that because for me, this is my experience. Can you help me understand this more deeply? So what I've done is I've got this bucket of like vulnerability versus openness. And I have it, if I'm doing a remote podcast, I have like split screen there on one side, my roadmap is on the other. If I'm in person, I'll sometimes have like an iPad with my notes. Sometimes I've prepared enough that it's like more or less in my head, but it's nice to have it to refer to. And then I can listen to, like, as I'm hearing them talk, I'm listening and I'm giving them a lot of space to speak. I'm not jumping in. I'm letting them really go in their course, but I'll anchor something where it's like, they said something that's going to take me where I'm really trying to get them. And when I hook it to where what they've already touched on or speaking, in terms of natural conversation, it indicates that I'm listening. They feel connected with me and I'm touching on something they've already brought up. And because I've done my research, I know it's material that they want to discuss. And I'm literally just bridging them right into what they want to be doing anyway. But I'm getting them to adhere to my roadmap. And I find that typically I hit most, if not all, of my buckets during the course of an hour to 90-minute conversation. Especially because I also have some techniques for not letting people ramble, and like there's certain ways of kind of like corralling. But I typically hit my buckets, and very, very rarely do I have to say, okay, I want to ask you about something different.
Well, let's touch upon now the third one, which is how to make them feel comfortable. Because let's say now you got your roadmap, right? You've got, I like how you said, the buckets and the in a way, a constellation. I think that's really neat. And now you're there, you're sitting there kind of like this maybe, and depending on the software you're using, if it's remote or if you're in person, you're there, you haven't hit go yet, or maybe you hit go but you're still haven't begun. And so what do you do to help the guest feel safe, in your words?
Yeah. So I much prefer in-person podcasts. There's no substitute for the vibe of body language and energy. I love having someone in my home. So there's a whole thing of like making them comfortable, being a good host, getting them water, like getting them settled down and present. Um, One of the big keys for making a guest feel safe is you should, in my opinion, you should always give your guest final cut on the content. Basically, what I say is I say, look, this is a home game. I want you to feel free to discuss anything you want. You have final cut. If you want me to edit something, I'll take it out. If you want to review this and give me timestamps to pull it out, if you don't want it on the podcast, it's not going to be public. And there have been times where I've had juicy stuff that people didn't want to share, but I'm not a journalist. I'm not like trying to get like, I'm trying to expose somebody. I want them to feel
the
safe.
dirt.
Yeah, the dirt. I'm not trying to get the dirt. I want them to feel safe. And so I find that when they have final cut on the content, they get to be much more vulnerable. And for me, it's all about the shared vulnerability. And a good podcast is a process of deepening vulnerability. Because when someone is listening to a podcast, information is valuable. And perhaps they've even come to the podcast because they want to know about polyvagal theory, for example. They want to know about that. But something happens when you listen to people speak and there's real authentic connection and there is real risk taking and confessional vulnerability. Emotionally, you tune in more. You hear it more. If someone is having an emotional experience, you are probably evolutionarily inclined to consider salience to that, which will allow your memory to anchor that information better. And it's also just better radio. So I really want my guests to take risks with me. And the best way I can do that out the gate is say, look, this is yours. If you don't like the podcast, I won't even publish the podcast. If you don't think you did a great job, we can record it again. Like, this is for you. It's a home game. And that goes a long way to make people feel safe. The research makes people feel safe if they know that you respect them enough to have looked at their work, to understand who they are, and to really take it seriously. That makes a big difference. And then for me, now, I don't know who's listening to this or what kind of podcast they want to do. I do 2 podcasts. I do one called the Psychedelic Therapy Podcast, which is very professional and very much about the content. And then I do Life is a Festival, which is very personal. For the Psychedelic Therapy Podcast, it's more informational, and it's not appropriate for me to talk about myself that much, even to talk about it and then edit it out. It just doesn't, that's not what we're there to do. There's a little bit of that because a little bit really helps. For Life is a Festival, I want to offer my vulnerability. I want to share something that's hard for me and make it real, like something that's like, I don't know if I want this on the podcast. I might want to edit this out. But when I do that, there's a deepening. And I did a podcast with the musician Alex Ebert, and we'd never met before. He's the lead singer for Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros, and we didn't quite lock in the beginning. I think he was the one who was like, because we were in the pre-podcast sort of banter, we're talking about kinky sex, and he's like, why don't we just talk about the kinky sex? I was like, okay, all right, like, not what I came here to do, but it ended up being like a way of dropping deeper, which meant that our further conversations about addiction and suicidality, he had a sense of like wanting to give me the goods because I gave him the goods because I was willing to talk about my sexuality. And I did end up leaving that in the podcast because it was a more authentic conversation. And so when you take risks and show yourself in service of the guest, they'll really resonate. The risk is you don't want to be one of those podcasters who's talking about themselves ad nauseum on podcasts. It gets very boring, and you want people to want to come back every week. So you want your audience to get little pieces of you, and they're interested and excited, and they want to know that what you care most about is making the guest look good, because that's how it actually makes you look good, and that's what makes everybody feel good. So be careful about being self-indulgent. Don't have a famous doctor on your podcast and spend 30 minutes talking about your personal meditation practice, which I did on my first podcast. And I was so disgusted. I didn't record another podcast for 3 months. And then you're going to make mistakes, of course, because that's how you learn. And that's what iterative process is. So you listen to it. You can always fix shit in the edit. And for anyone who's podcasting, do not expect to be good at this when you start. You're not good at anything when you start. But I've done 200 podcasts, something like that. And I would say I'm reasonably good at podcasting. Reasonably.
You got skills. You got skills.
I'm no Tim Rogan, but you know.
Well, look, you made a couple of really great points there. One, which is essentially, vulnerability kind of opens up the guest, dares, kind of takes risks, which I love. I think you also highlighted how oftentimes the beginning of a conversation is actually, some people call them like throwaway questions, but I don't see them quite like that. I just see that it's a natural process of warming up to the moment and laying a foundation, right? And I'll say on my side, what I do actually before I begin the podcast typically is I'll just invite a minute meditation, right? But with the guest, because oftentimes, they've come through whatever it is they're doing, right? And maybe just now flipped to, especially if it's online, they've just flipped all of a sudden to this and carrying whatever it is they were doing. And me, myself, usually I'm fuddling with the tech stuff. And, so I usually say, hey, I'd love a minute meditation. Are you open to that? And they're usually like, definitely. So we just do it, we just drop in, hit record. And then by the time we arrive, at least there's a little bit of almost like a ritual container created for the conversation, right? And you can do many things to do that. You could invoke a dedication, or I don't know. There's lots of ways, right? You can create a ritual container, but I feel that was really helpful for me and the guest to feel a sense of, okay, they can trust this kind of grounded entry into the conversation as a key element as well. And then the third thing you mentioned around talking about yourself too much. Yes, I totally think that there is a really important balance to strike, because, if you never talk about yourself, you're sort of unknown to the listeners too, right? You're sort of too opaque in a way. But then again, if you talk too much, or if you interject too much, right? This is something maybe I want to talk about in a second, is you can really show a kind of, interruptive energy to the conversation that actually isn't useful. I've actually heard Russell Brand do this with, I think it was the filmmaker, Adam Curtis. I don't know if you heard of the interview that he did with Adam Curtis. But I don't know if Russell had 8 cups of coffee or, something, but he was his usual trickster nature, but he was very frenetic and jokey to the point where, this prestigious English filmmaker is kind of like he's just kind of getting flummoxed by this character who just won't settle down to have this conversation. Right. So certainly there's a way to balance both your own story and letting the flow happen, but also be a stern hand in a way, right, to guide where the conversation wants to go.
Yeah, just to speak to 2 of your points briefly is, for me, I say it takes about 20 minutes to drop in the pocket on a podcast. And I actually have a fan of my show once told me that he's like, I go on the same walk every time I listen to your show, and the show always gets good at the same place on the same walk, which is basically 20 minutes in. Nice. And it takes a while for people to get comfortable, for you to like do some mirror neuron stuff. We're 20 minutes in now. And not to say that that's a strict limitation or like that's just how it goes. I've noticed that for me with my show and the way that I do it, it's about 20 minutes. So having some patience, and I love the ritual setting. What I do for mine is I ask people if they have rituals. And so I kind of like opt into their experience. I once had the musician Nick Mulvey on my show, and it was remote, and he talked about lighting a candle for his ancestors. And I was like, shit, that's fucking dope. And then I had a candle right there, and I was like, I'm lighting a candle for my ancestors too. We're bringing in the ancestors for this conversation. And so it's fun. You're building camaraderie, and I like the kind of opt-in. And then the last thing is about interrupting. Something I got from Tim Ferriss, who I really admire his interviewing. And there's a great podcast where he's being interviewed. I think it's called the Divergent Podcast with Neil Potts. I'll figure out which one it is, and I'll send you so you have the link.
Great.
But it's 3 hours of Tim being interviewed about interviewing, and it's great. He goes through the whole podcasting thing. It's a great resource. And when I'm coaching people or mentoring people about podcasts, I'll often send that to them. One thing he said in that, which I love, is that your silence can actually be a really profound interviewing tool. So often in conversation, we want to fill the silence, and someone might get to a place where they've landed, and especially if there's some emotion, you can pause and you can give them some space, and then all of a sudden they actually go deeper in a way that they wouldn't necessarily have done with a zinger question from you. It's just about letting it breathe. And I don't like interrupting people. Sometimes people are hardcore ramblers, and you kind of have, I've even timed out a podcast where I've been like, I want to pause for a second. let's take a step back. You know, if someone's really, really rambling, like kind of rein it in a little bit. But in general, they're your guest, man. Let them talk.
Let's talk about questions then too, right? Because I think one of the mistakes I made early on, and I think many do, is they ask questions that are too complex, right? They'll kind of, offer a kind of riff on something, right? And I still have to catch myself sometimes because I'm so interested in what, was just said, and maybe I have some question that I'm working out. But if I don't end with a precise, articulation of, okay, now over to you, to my guest, right? I find that often they are kind of like, they get lost right in the thicket of all of the things that you talked about, and they actually don't know how to respond. And so I was actually surprised to understand over time, the more simple questions I could ask, the better the responses were, right? And by simple too, it doesn't mean necessarily, it doesn't mean dumb down. It just means, precisely lean, that allows a really strong jump off point, so somebody knows what they're responding to, rather than a kind of confused search right through what you've just said to find your question.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a big growth edge for me, and also why it's so good to listen to the recording. I noticed what I was doing is I would actually ask like 3 questions in a row. Like, I'd be so excited and I'd be like, so, but how did you start doing this? And like, what was like the impetus for this? And like, did you call your mom before like I would just like throw in, like, I'd be so excited that I'd like throw in 3 questions. And what I found, first of all, like, it's helpful when you notice a tick like that to just be mindful of it and just sort of like habit correct it, which is what I've tried to do. And I don't always do that. But just as you say, like, the potency and the leanness of the question actually gives them more space, because they're not preparing for the interview in the way that you are. They're not like writing down all of their ideas. And if you give them too wide a berth, they'll go all over the place. So I think that what's helpful is like, what do you really want to know? Like, while this person is speaking to you. So I don't have a list of questions. And a lot of times my question is based on what they've just said. And I really try to hone in on like, what do I want to know? Like, I'm a smart dude. I know a lot of things. I don't need to know like, what is Burning Man? I mean, there's a different way of going about that. There's a question that will more nail what I really want to know. So I think it's helpful. It's nice to respond to your guest and take a moment to share an idea of yours that feels in sync or reflection or something. That's great. And then as you're directing them into the next space that you want to support them in going, what question do you most want to know? Because it's inevitably, that's what the listener is. They're in their head and they're like, yeah, but why did he do that? Like, why? And then you're like, but why did you do that? Why? That's crazy. And I find that like the tone in which you ask the question is part of it too. Like, and just like, I think humor is extraordinarily important because it keeps people's attention, and especially when you're dealing with subject matter that can be really painful. It's actually nice to bring in appropriate humor on subjects like death and sickness and stuff like that. It's interesting how it works. But what's the tone? I mean, how do you want them to answer? And the very inflection of your question is going to tee them up to answer in a certain way. So if your question is very woolly and you haven't really thought it through and it's a little bit rambly, that's what you're going to get back. But if your question is like, yeah, but this is important to me. Like, this is something I've struggled with. How have you solved this problem that I have not solved? I want to know. Like, I want to know this. And then there's a gravitas to which they will then respond. Where like, here's an earnest, inquiring person who really wants to know about something that I've spent years researching. I'm going to nail it because this person is longing for the answer. So I think keep it lean, keep it potent, and also ask with your heart. Ask what you want to know and want the answer, because then they'll really give it to you.
This brings up the point too of essentially your role as a host, as a in a way like a stand-in.
Shaman.
Possibly.
I'm just kidding. We should never call ourselves shamans.
I was going to say stand-in for the listener who obviously isn't there to ask questions, that they are maybe thinking as they're listening, right? So for example, my friend brought this up to me where, let's say somebody's saying something particularly maybe inflammatory, right? Or particularly kind of edgy, or challenging in a way that maybe a number of your listeners, right, would feel the need to follow up on that question, right? And be like, what? Well, and that if you don't do that, that actually kind of breaks trust. It breaks trust with your listeners, because they might feel, oh, he didn't take that opportunity to ask what so many of us are likely thinking, like the ability to intuit, right? And to say, well, okay, what you said there, that's a pretty edgy thing you just said, and I wonder, let's spend more time with it, because, we don't want to just shuffle along and forget that, this has a lot of weight, what you said. Like, you can tee it up, I find, even like that, right? To say that this needs more space or more time, or to be challenged in a way, depending on the style of your podcast, right? I mean, if it's hardcore journalism, be quite different, but you can still do that, I think, in a conversational, wondering together, where you're respectfully challenging versus, trying to, I don't know, out them or something.
Totally. And I really love the way that the example that you're giving here and the way that you approach it. I think the thing you have to remember is, like, your job is to make your guest look their best. Your job is to make them feel good and give their best performance. You want to be the host where they leave the interview and they're like, I fucking nailed it. I nailed it. That's the best I've ever described something I've spent 10 years working on. And so, yeah, they want to be challenged, because that's going to give them their best material. They don't want you to dodge the hard questions, but they also want to know that you're on their side, and that you're not challenging them so that you can expose them. You're actually providing them an opportunity to give the clarity that maybe others would be afraid to do. And as you've just said, you're like, I think this needs a little more space. Let's pause on this for a moment, because I don't think I quite understand it, because it doesn't feel fair. Do you think that this is fair? Like that sort of thing where they know you're on their side, but they're also feeling challenged, like a brother, like in terms of brotherhood. And I actually mean brotherhood in a non-gendered way. This is an ISTA reference, but like, we are all each other's brothers. Maybe this is too dense of things to throw in on a podcast interview conversation, but like the brotherhood of, I will challenge you in support of you. That's the energy. And I don't miss those opportunities to do that, because that can be some of the best parts of a podcast. And that could be something where you learn the most. I mean, maybe you have an immediate reactive judgment, as your audience might have. And by showing up and being like, no, I need to know this because I respect you, but I can't see how this would be true. Help me understand. Then all of a sudden, that's actually building deeper trust.
Yeah. Well said. Well, I think last point that at least I had, and you may have one or two more, but this to me centers around the ability to dance between this structure and emergence, right? The kind of the roadmap and the mystery, and how, for me at least, and I think for the listeners and for the guest, some of the most powerful moments, of course, are when you both arrive somewhere that you didn't expect, right, in the conversation. And it's like, typically you can feel it, right? You can feel this kind of aha, or this like wow, or this awe of arriving somewhere in a conversation, which I call, again, that revelation or the revelatory moment, where suddenly something emerges that, again, separated from this experience or this encounter, may not have happened, right? It was all the factors at play that brought us to these moments. And particularly, there was a conversation with Bayo Kamalafe, who's a sort of philosopher, writer, where we had this conversation around masculinity, and we arrived somewhere around this, in a way, the consequence of the absence of village for men, in the way that their capacity or their inability to ever come home from the quest, that they've been sort of inadvertently put on, like that still, yeah. This still stays with me, though, as a rendering of something that surfaced, only because of, again, the willingness, the preparation, the leaning in of both of us, and the context of the moment. These kinds of things, these gems, right, are so powerful. And so for me, it's not something that you can't necessarily aim at, because, again, it's the mystery. But all of these factors together can deliver you to these moments of revelation that, for me, are, one of the major reasons why I love podcasting in the first place.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of, like, this is kind of why we're here. So rather than trying to fabricate an experience like that because it'd be good for the audience, I think that, well, for me at least, I go into a podcast interview, and I'm at a point in my career where I can interview mostly people I want to interview. So I'm not like building a reputation. So I can ask people who I know know about shit that I need to know. Like I know that they know better than me about things. And I open myself up to have a transformative experience where I want to be challenged in my presuppositions, and I want to be open to that. And at the same time, I'm not grasping for it. And actually, it's funny, I did a podcast this morning, and it was with Adam Aronovich, who does this project called Healing from Healing, which is very much at the edge of the work that I'm doing right now, which is like getting lost in the healing journey and waking up out of it. And he managed somehow, and my podcast is Life is a Festival, he managed to bring it back to like the antidote to this healing from healing is the festival. And I'm like, I couldn't, like, I would have done anything to have made that be what the podcast was, but he brought it back to this like thing of like, not, you know, the non-self seriousness of celebration and community. And it ended up being this beautiful bookend to the whole conversation. And what I've found is that the more authentic conversation I'm willing to have, and paradoxically, the less I'm thinking about the audience, because I've built up the techniques and skills so that I kind of know what I'm doing, the more I'm able to like have experiences that are properly revelatory to me, which I know will be revelatory to my audience. And it's like any art form. There's two aspects of any art form, which is your technique and the Holy Ghost, right? Like, you know, and I'm not Christian, but I like the idea of the Holy Ghost. But like you develop the dexterity of your fingertips and your music theory so that you can do all sorts of things on the guitar. And then once the spirit moves you, you're playing stuff that you're not quite sure where it's coming from. And podcasting is no different. A really rich, deep, earnest, heartfelt conversation can be imbued with the Holy Ghost. You may have something where it feels like grace, that you've gone through a thorny topic and somehow you've landed on good medicine that you needed, and medicine that you know your guests are going to need, or your audience is going to need, and possibly your guest is going to need too. It doesn't happen all the time, but if you got a podcast, you might be doing this every week. Bound to happen sometimes, you know, and that's again why it's so beautiful that it's iterative. It's really, I gotta say, I gotta wax poetic for a minute. Such a great art form. Somehow we are in an era where people are just down to drive their car and listen to two people they've never met talk to each other. What a thing, you know, and there's a lot of podcasts, there's a lot of attention to all sorts of things, and you're asking someone to spend an hour listening to you talk to somebody. Well, you're going to have to put your best into it. But if you bring your authentic self, you properly research, you make your guests feel safe, you've created the structure of a conversation, but you're not beholden to it, chances are you're going to have the kind of magic moments where someone is like, wow, that was a good hour spent. I want to tell my friends about it. I'm going to send this podcast to my friends. And that's how you're going to begin to build the reputation and the audience and the thing that you really want as an artist with your craft. So yeah, bring all the pieces together, show up, and just keep doing it, because you'll be garbage at it when you start, and just keep going and keep iterating. And then sometime in your early podcasting, you'll get that sweet moment where a zeitgeisty thing will happen, and you'll be like, oh, yeah, no, I can do something with this, and you just build on it.
Well wrapped, good sir. So thanks.
Were we wrapped?
That was a good. That was a. We'll come back for more, I have no doubt. But let me say this then: if the dear listeners really wants to learn more about your podcast, isn't already a listener but should be, check it out. Life is a Festival. Google that; they'll find it on all the major platforms. And
I'll say something about that. There are different kinds of podcasts, and obviously we're talking about like unscripted interview style podcasts. That's basically what we're talking about today. I think it's helpful to choose a podcast theme and title that gives you a lot of range. I do the psychedelic therapy podcast, and it's psychedelic therapy, and it's for psychedelic therapists, and I love it, and I also get paid to do it, so it's great. But Life is a Festival can be whatever I want it to be, because my life is a festival, and it can be sexuality, and it can be psychedelics, and all the boundary pushing things that I care about. So people are like, is that a podcast about festivals? Well, not really. It's a podcast about what Eamon likes, and through the lens of how can we make our lives more joyful and more like a festival. And so I have a lot of range where if I meet a really interesting person, like I did a podcast about prison reform. I just met a really interesting person and I was like, wow, we should really care about prisons. They're like the opposite of a festival. That's a podcast.
Well said. Well, I think we hit the mark, I'd say, with this particular interview about interviews. What'd you say?
Yeah, I think, well, Ian, I think you did a great job. I think you didn't talk too much about yourself. You had some nice insight. And actually, I'm going to reflect on you that you've been doing this for a while now, and obviously I deeply respect your work in many avenues. But what I liked is that you had a really nice balance of offering some of your own insight where it mattered most. And there was a moment in the conversation where you talked about challenging questions and you offered the way that you do it in a way that I was like, yeah, the way Ian said, that's a good way to do it. And you kind of shared the load of having to deliver this information by offering your own perspective, which further emboldened me. So like as an interviewer, like we're teammates, we're trying to make this all happen. I'm your guest, so I really am the star of the show. And you did a good job of making me feel that way and make me pumped up and smiling at me. And I love it.
If I did that, there you go. Now you feel like the big shot.
Well, actually, no, that's too much because now I'm looking at myself and I'm like, ooh, so
all right, there we go.
But yeah, I've really felt, and obviously we have an existing relationship, but I really felt like in camaraderie with you, which helped me do my best. And where I'd like to end is that I feel it when it's been a good interview.
Yeah.
If at the end of the interview I'm exhausted, I know that I've been spending so much brain power trying to wrangle this in a certain way. If I end the podcast and I'm like, I feel pretty good, I'm gonna go do something I like. Like I feel energy in my body moving. It's like, yeah, that was a good conversation. This might be helpful to people. And my brother Ian here asked me to help him out, and I think I did a good job. And so I feel good about myself. Like that's you can feel, and then you'll listen back to the edit, and you'll be like, oh yeah, no, pretty good.
I love that actually as an indication of success. Is do you feel energized by the end of it? Because that's a really great marker, and I feel that too. Yeah, I feel like the energy of the divine whatever spirit coming in to animate this conversation that I think will no doubt be of use for folks interested in this subject matter. So
my only regret is that I don't really do a lot of video things, and I realize I've been like low and small the whole time. And you're like perfectly proportioned with your like wood panel wall, and like I feel like I could have just done a little.
Well, there's always room to grow. There's always room to grow, Eamon.
Hey, and that's the final lesson today, young podcasters. There's always room to grow, even if you've been doing this for a number of years.
Okay, onward we go. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, brother.